Okay, so let's get to it. All right, so today's lecture is all about space medicine. But before we get into that, we were talking about advances in medicine and technologies that are impacting patient care. So you remember I told you about the first xeno transplant of a pig's heart into a human host. And then we talked about new methods for grafting hands so they stayed viable and hand auto transplants. So this is hot off the press. This is about 24 hours old, but the world's first eyeball transplant took place recently and just made headlines in Nature and BBC in the past 24 hours. So face transplants are still relatively novel. They've only been pioneered over the past 14 years. So this was a partial face transplant, only the 19th in the world, and the world's first full eyeball transplant. Part of this is cosmetic, but there's also some thinking that hopefully that they can maybe activate the retinal layer to and the eyes to be able to sense again because the retinal tissue still looks healthy. So just to kind of let you know how quickly medicine is changing and how innovation comes about every single day. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk about space medicine on the moon, Mars, and beyond, as well as returns for Earth. So we talked a little bit about my background last time. I'm not going to get too much into it here for the specifics because we're actually going to talk about it later this lecture and what it means for preparation for spaceflight. We talked about my disclosures last time, so I'm not going to rehash them here. Safe to say that here they are. Okay, so by the end of this lecture, I hope that you will get a sense of the hazards of the spaceflight environment, tools available for mitigating those risks, the challenges and design constraints of packing for space, how we prepare on Earth using analog test beds as a preparation for space, the value of emerging technologies when it comes to designing for space medicine challenges, this being a technology and this future of medicine class, as well as emerging challenges in space medicine. And there's a bonus one, number 7, returns for Earth and benefit for humanity that we'll talk about at the very end. So let's start with a thought experiment. Say you are the crew doctor and you are going to the moon today. So my question to you is, how are you going to pack? What are you going to pack? So what framework are you going to use and how are you going to go about figuring out what you need to survive on the moon and keep your crew healthy? So one approach is you can use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with survival and then safety, and then going all the way towards thriving and performance and self-actualization. Although I would argue, this being 2024, there's probably even a more basic need that all of us have. So the more serious answer to that question is, in order to know what we're packing for, we need to know the environment we're packing for. So when we talk about the challenges and the hazards of the space flight environment, we talk about a whole laundry list of challenges, including everything from increased radiation. So we're exposed to, if we're talking about in general terms, 1 unit of radiation exposure, not worrying about whether that's in grays or sieverts, 1 unit of radiation exposure at sea level, we're exposed over the course of a day, we're exposed to 40-fold that exposure, even over the course of a transatlantic flight. And then by the time you get to the level of the International Space Station, that's 250-fold what you would experience at sea level. So radiation is one of the concerns. We talk about the acceleration and deceleration, increased G loads of launch and landing. There's altered day-night cycles. So when you're at the level of the International Space Station, 250 miles, approximately 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, you are subject to 16 sunrise-sunset cycles per 24-hour period, or 1 sunrise or sunset every 90 minutes by rate of your orbital. So you can imagine that has impacts on your circadian rhythm. You're in a very isolated, confined environment, so you have to play nice with your crewmates. It's always awkward when you're the astronaut that's voted off the space station. And you have you're away from your creature comforts at home. You can't just wander down to the local Starbucks. You're not next to your friends and family. It can be quite stressful. Astronauts on ISS are famously scheduled down to the 5-minute mark. You have to trust the engineering of your spaceship to protect you from the temperature extremes, the environmental extremes of the vacuum of space. So from the temperature, the vacuum, the radiation, the threat of micrometeorite and orbital debris. You have to trust the engineering and closed loop life support systems, or the ECLIS systems, to keep your atmosphere of your space station within habitable confines of humidity, temperature, and pressure. You have to trust that the organic compounds in your immediate vicinity won't immediately off gas and create noxious fumes. And then, of course, is the everyday risks and lumps and bumps of things that you would occur in day-to-day life on Earth, whether it's injury, cuts, bumps, fractures, etc. And then, of course, your medical supply is resource limited. And then there's everything that we haven't so far talked about, but that most people think about when they think about the spaceflight environment. And that, of course, is the weightless elephant in the room, 0G. And the summary is that every single bodily system is affected by the spaceflight environment. So that means without being loaded in 1G, which all of us here today have the luxury of being in, unless you're beaming in from space, in which case, amazing. Your bones lose density. So your bones lose density at a rate of 1 to 2% per month. And without countermeasures, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that could reflect a weaker or osteoporotic state. The muscles are similarly lose mass. Our inner ears get confused. So when we talk about how we perceive where we are in space and balance, it's this delicate balance between what our eyes see, where our proprioceptors in our skin perceive our body to be in space, and what our inner ears perceive as up or down. And when there's a mismatch between those three, this can actually make us violently ill, causing space adaptation syndrome. So where astronauts get violently ill, up to 50% do, for the first 24 to 72 hours on station. So I'll spare you the mental image of what it's like to throw up in 0G, other than being gross. If you're doing something critical, like a spacewalk, and you're in a confined space in your extravehicular activity EVA spacesuit, it can pose a real asphyxiation risk or get into your eyes and impede your vision. Again, there's also fluid shifts. Every single bodily system is affected. So talking about how that affects the cardiovascular system, there's numerous impacts. So when you're in the 1G condition, as you can see in the first schematic on the left of the screen, you trust the valves in your veins to allow one-way venous return back to the heart. In the microgravity environment, that fluid shifts upwards, and then so there's less venous cooling in the feet, and so that is a number of impacts. The heart becomes smaller and more spherical. There's less work to be done against gravity in the microgravity environment, and then by the time you get back to the 1G condition, those valves in your veins, which haven't had to work all this time, suddenly have become decompensated. Blood can pool in your feet, and astronauts, particularly women astronauts, are more prone to orthostatic hypotension or simply fainting when they come back to Earth. And so if you see an astronaut being carried off of their Soyuz capsule, as pretty much all of them are, it's not just pomp and circumstance with the garlands and the hero's welcome. It's actually a safety issue. And the other interesting consequence of floating in microgravity is that these upward fluid shifts creates this puffy, round appearance that is aptly named the moon face appearance, which you can see here in Japanese astronaut Jackie Mukai, how she looks rounder and more puffy in the 0G environment. We can even see this over the course of a parabolic flight when we do our 20-second parabolas at a time. And the other consequence of this is that we feel congested, we may have congestion headaches, food may not taste as good, so the food sent up to station needs to be more flavorful, textured, savory. So we're going to keep on this track of fluids because the impacts don't stop there, because the relatively new finding on the block, about 15 years old now, is the finding of the space flight associated neuroocular syndrome. So the fluid that we haven't talked about yet is cerebrospinal brain and spine juice that bathes our central nervous system, our brains and our spines, and typically under 1G conditions, drains without any impedance. In the microgravity or 0G environment, this drainage is thought to be impaired due to some combination. We don't know exactly how or why yet, but it's thought to be due to a combination of decreased and impaired venous drainage, CSF drainage, and lymphatic drainage. What does this mean clinically? Is that in a certain subset of astronauts, particularly male astronauts, in long duration spaceflight over 30 days, again, we don't know why, this can lead to pockets of increased intracranial pressure, particularly behind the eyes as the optic nerve exits into the brain, causing increased pressure and even edema on the optic nerve. And the clinical implication is that in a certain subset of astronauts, this can lead to hyperopia or farsightedness and vision shifts. So that is one of the notable gender differences in astronauts, having preponderance for male astronauts. Again, the mechanisms through which that exists still remain to be delineated, whereas women astronauts are more prone to fainting or orthostatic hypotension that we talked about a few slides ago, and also are more prone to bladder infections by virtue of having a shorter urethra than men. Men are more likely to suffer from age-related hearing loss. If we talk about cardiovascular changes in men, they're more likely to exhibit arrhythmia on orbit versus any changes post-flight. And overall, when it comes to performance and cognition, we don't see any differences between the genders. So talking a little bit more into and delving more into this, when we talk about women's health in space, we're actually closer to 700 people in space now, but still only 11 to 12% of that have been women, and 1% have been Black women, by virtue of the origins of human spaceflight. Remember, this came from the Cold War era when it was more of a political showdown than it was an exploratory and scientific endeavor. And so the typical people who went to space in the early days of human spaceflight were military pilots, Caucasian. So that's we're still playing catch up when it comes to leveling the playing field of who goes to space, and that has impacts on the data. It's a very small subset to begin with, an N of 600 to 700, and then when we isolate for gender-based effects, it's even smaller than that. So when we talk about gaps in women's health in space, very famously, there's that running joke about how Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, second after Valentina Tereshkova, probably third after Svetlana Savitskaya. She was famously asked if she was taking, makeup with her. NASA initially calculated 200 tampons for a 6-day space flight, and then realized that they'd miscalculated and more reasonably brought it down to 100. And again, side note, if you're using that many tampons during a single cycle, go see a doctor. That's not normal. So when we talk about women's health impacts in the spaceflight environment, we also don't have necessarily a clear picture of how the menstrual cycle is affected in space, because most or many female astronauts opt for period suppression by using continuous oral contraceptives for period management. So there is some thought that the blood clogs up the toilet on the ISS because it's considered a solid in a engineering device that is built to handle liquids. So we're going to talk a little bit more about reproduction in space at the end of this lecture. So I'll skip over that for now. We talked a little bit about gender-based differences. Here it is in written format. So we talked about many of these already. We didn't talk about gender-based differences when it comes to motion sickness. So we taught that space adaptation syndrome that we see on the International Space Station. Women tend to be more prone to that, yet men tend to be more prone to reentry sickness. We talked about orthostatic hypotension and spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. We didn't talk about some of the practical issues of fit. So when we talk about spacewalks, the EVA suits, the extravehicular activity spacesuits that astronauts use, are sized to the astronaut, accounting for changes. So we can grow in the spaceflight environment, our spines deep, and we can get a few inches there. So, but proportions are actually still different between men and women. So women going to a pressurized spacesuit may still have more pressure points on things like their shoulder joints because of how the spacesuits are designed. And the other part of that is women have more lax ligaments, so that can also make them more prone to injury over the course of a spacewalk. So here's a good summary on gender adaptation in space. I've included the link for you in case you're interested. The next slide is also for interest because we once had a dentistry student in space, but just to kind of show you how far all of the areas of aerospace and space medicine go when we're talking about impacts in space. So why do we need to think about dentistry in space? So the crew medical officer up on the International Space Station is trained to drain abscessed teeth and even pull teeth if it comes to that, because that has come up in spaceflight before over one of the Soviet and Russian space flights where an astronaut had to basically endure excruciating dental pain for 2 weeks of his mission. So we talked about the decline in bone mass. That actually also applies to teeth as well. So there might be an increased propensity for dental issues to come up in spaceflight. If we have fillings or dental work, we need to make sure that they're secure and robust because the G-forces during launch can actually dislodge improperly placed dental work such as crowns and bridges. So when we talk about how we evaluate dental health and fitness for flight, we talk about class 1, class 2, class 3. So class 3 is if we don't address it prior to flight, it will probably result in a dental emergency over the next 12 months versus class 1 will not. And then class 2, somewhere in between. Okay. So this is just kind of to tell you that this really is a golden age for space medicine research because we're seeing a very integrated interdisciplinary approach come out of space medicine. And so, oh, is there a question there? Okay, sorry. So this is the NASA twins study that came out in Science. So this was basically, there's 2 identical twins, Scott Kelly, Mark Kelly, both are Navy pilots, both are NASA astronauts. Scott Kelly was selected to spend a year up in space. Mark Kelly spent a year on Earth. So by virtue of being identical twins, the assumption is they have the identical DNA and genome. And so any impacts we see are due to the effects of the spaceflight environment. And so to give you an idea of how comprehensive this paper was, so the summary paper came out in late 2017 and then met final publication in about 2019 in Science. And it covered all aspects of everything from the macro level to cognition and performance to the molecular level, even looking at epigenetics, proteomics, DNA methylation, biochemical changes, and everything in between, such as the immune system function. So we haven't talked about this yet, but the immune system is suppressed in the spaceflight environment, and germs are more virulent. So Scott Kelly was actually the first person to administer a vaccine in space. He gave himself the flu shot, and he actually mounted an appropriate immune response. So that's a win there. Interestingly, telomeres were found to be lengthened on his spaceflight. So telomeres typically are a marker of aging and shorten as we age. So this was a really unexpected result because, as a side digression, when we talk about the overall impacts of the spaceflight environment, they point to accelerated aging, such as prediabetes, insulin resistance, and increased cardiovascular and arterial stiffening. So, but when he came back to Earth, they resumed their normal shortening. So it was a very interesting and unexpected finding. This also looked at the gut microbiome, metabolomics. So when I say this was a comprehensive paper, it was a very comprehensive paper, very worth a read if you're interested. So you can just look up NASA's twin study. And the surprises keep coming. So as recently as 2019, during routine handheld diagnostic imaging experiments up on station, the study was just to visualize the jugular veins with an ultrasound, and then surprise, there was found to be a floating thrombus or blood clot in the jugular veins of one of the astronauts, who also happened to be on oral contraceptives. So the thought was, well, what is this about the spaceflight environment that led to this blood clot? Was it bad luck? Is there something about being in spaceflight that leads to increased blood clot risk or a thrombogenic state? And then in certain populations, oral contraceptives can also lead to increased risk for blood clots. So that was a new finding, which suggested another risk to look out for. We've long heard of spaceflight anemia, wherein the astronauts are found to have a decreased red blood cell mass. For the longest time, part of this was thought to be dilutional and also excretional. But recently, in the past 2 years, a Canadian team also found out there's increased hemolysis or red blood cell breakdown in spaceflight that contributes to this. So here's a good summary paper from about 1 or 2 years ago, 2022, talking about the challenges of human health in spaceflight. So all of this, if you remember nothing from this part of the lecture, it's simply that space is trying to kill you. And that's just what we know from 6 decades of research in low Earth orbit. So then the question becomes, what happens when we go beyond LEO? And this isn't a theoretical question, it's a very real question, because NASA and its international partners, including the Canadian Space Agency, have very real plans to go to the moon and beyond, starting with Lunar Gateway. So this is humanity's first deep space station, due to begin construction over the next few years. It will be smaller than the International Space Station. My favorite fact about the ISS is there are 20-year-olds alive today who do not know a world where it's, abnormal or extraordinary to have a continuously crewed off-world presence. And maybe in 20 years' time, there will be 20-year-olds alive for whom it is totally normal to have a deep space station orbiting the moon. So smaller than ISS, it will not be continuously crewed. Unlike ISS, it has several scientific mandates, including Earth observation, lunar observation, sun observation, and also to serve as a waypoint between Earth and the lunar surface. So here's another schematic and the contributions of the various partners. So Canada will be reprising its role as the robotics arm expert. So we already have Canadarm1, Canadarm2, Dexter. So Canadarm3 will be our contribution. And then the idea is that the moon gateway will also pave the way for the Artemis missions. So Artemis 1 has already taken place. That was an uncrewed mission around the moon as a proof of concept of the vehicle that would take astronauts to the moon. They also sent some mannequins with radiation dosimeters, as well as novel radiation protection to just see what the radiation environment would be like. Artemis 2 will be the first humans to orbit the moon this century, including the first non-American nation to go into cislunar orbit, and that is us. So that's the Canadians. So Jeremy Hansen will be on that mission, which is just incredible to say in this day and age, for those of you who are fans of Canadian exploration. And the idea is Artemis 2 will pave the way for the subsequent Artemis missions. So Artemis 3 will be first boots on the ground. That is NASA's plan to put the next man, first person of color, and first woman on the moon, and the view towards establishing permanent surface operations, performing lunar exploration, scientific returns, and then also next step, using the moon as a test bed for Mars. And it's not just the space agencies who are looking towards Mars. The commercial companies are out there too. So SpaceX, Elon Musk has very famously said that he has plans to send humans to Mars. This is a very dated headline from 2016. So when we talk about sending humans to other planets, we don't talk about colonization anymore due to the connotations of the term. We talk about human settlement of other planets. And so there's not just SpaceX. Boeing will also has plans to get to the red planet, possibly even queuing a new space race. So what are the impacts to human health that we have to worry about when we talk about exploration class missions, that is missions to deep space, such as the moon, Mars, and beyond? So we know from the Apollo missions, there's a very good stack of data called Biomedical Lessons Learned from Apollo that talks about everything from the environment, the lunar environment. So we know from Biomedical Lessons of Apollo that lunar dust was a very potent skin, respiratory, and eye irritant. And so there's hundreds of pages of documentation to this, as well as the EVA suits they used for moonwalks. The fit and the center of gravity were an issue. So you can even just Google astronauts falling down on the moon, and there's clip after clip of, just them trying to navigate in these suits where the joints didn't necessarily bend where they needed them to, or the portable life support system on the back led to a higher center of gravity, leading to a higher propensity of falling down. So for anyone who ever tells you that the moon landing was faked, they definitely put a lot of effort into it. So you can read about some of these summaries here. So this is a paper that came out in Nature Microgravity about 2 years ago, and just talking about the summary of what we know and what the unknowns are when we talk about lunar dust toxicity risk. This also applies to Mars, although there's a slightly different chemical composition of the lunar toxicity, of the Martian dust consisting of perchlorates. So we talked a little bit about radiation, so let's go deeper into that now. So the summary is, the higher up you go, the more radiation you have to contend with. So we talked about 250x at the level of the International Space Station. But if you look at the schematic, you can see that you're still within the confines of the Van Allen belt. So those are these magnetic belts, part of the magnetosphere, that filter out higher energy ionizing radiation from galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events. So when you're beyond the Van Allen belts, you can be exposed up to 750x the radiation compared to a single day on Earth. So the other consideration of that, so here's a summary slide. Sorry, I should have said 700x compared to the Earth. So the other challenge of that is that all organs are not created alike. There are different sensitivities, say for an eye and bone marrow versus skin. Reproductive organs, especially in women, are especially susceptible. So breast, uterus, ovaries are more susceptible. So that's why we actually have specific annual and career limits, as well as organ-specific limits and gender-specific limits for radiation exposure. When it comes to astronaut health, they're considered radiation workers. And so here's a summary slide. And you can see here in some cases they were exceeded. So the annual limit of a blood-forming organ, such as bone marrow or the spleen, is 0.5 sievert. And on the Mir mission, which was a 1-year mission, it went slightly above the dose equivalent in sieverts. So you can imagine how these need to be mitigated when we think about radiation considerations for exploration class missions. The other thing is the distance. So when we talk about distances, for those of you who might be Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans, there's that quote that space is big. Space is so vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big, you wouldn't believe it. And so that means even sending radio signals out at the speed of light, depending on the alignment of Earth and Mars, you can expect a 6 to 48 minute round trip communication delay. So from the time I, as an astronaut on Mars, say, hey, mission control, I need the flight surgeon ASAP, we have a medical emergency, and you get back to me, that's 48 minutes. And if it's truly an emergency, that could be life-threatening. And so it gets a little bit more scary than that, because when the sun is between the Earth and Mars, that can lead to a complete communication blackout period of 2 to 3 weeks. So really, truly, if you are an astronaut on Mars during that blackout period and you have a medical emergency, to quote Taylor Swift, you're on your own, kid. When we talk about the challenges of deep space, to think about it within a framework, all of that I've told you can be summed up as the RIDGE framework. We talk about radiation, isolation, confinement, distance from Earth, altered gravity, and hostile environments. And hostile environments includes everything from the regolith that we talked about, the lunar toxicity and the Martian toxicity, dust risk, to altered day-night cycles. So when you are on the lunar equator surface, your day-night cycle is 14 days a day and 14 days of night. So that will definitely alter your circadian rhythm. And when we talk about other impacts of the hostile environment, this can also include everything from, just being remote. And when we talk about the circadian rhythm and what that looks like on Mars, it's the Martian day is 24 hours and 39 minutes, which seems innocuous and close enough to Earth that it's won't mess with our circadian rhythms too much. But if we're offsetting by close to 40 minutes to an hour a day, that means somewhere along the lines of 12 to 15 days down the road, we're actually 12 hours offset from Earth, making communications a little bit more challenging. So that is the lay of the land. Let's come back to our initial question. You are the crew doctor on an exploration class mission. What are you going to pack now, knowing all of those hazards that exist? So this question isn't meant to stress you out, because I want to talk now about the tools that we have at our disposal, starting with prevention. So historically, if you were a space agency astronaut going through a NASA or a CSA or a European Space Agency ESA selection, part of this starts with selection in that you are screened to be the healthiest of the healthy. This includes a very rigorous physical, psychological, and physiological selection. It continues on with pre, post, and in-flight risk mitigation, monitoring, rehab, as well as countermeasures, as well as nutrition. So we'll talk about the in-flight countermeasures on the next slide. But for example, we talked a little bit about nutrition earlier, in that it has to be palatable, otherwise astronauts won't eat it, but it also has to have a long shelf life, it has to be low mass, it has to be nutritious, and it has to be something that meets with the daily caloric equivalent and needs of the astronaut. So something like an orange is actually considered a luxury because it's heavy, it's full of water, it has a finite shelf life. If something needs to be refrigerated, well, that's a no-go. So there's a lot of just add water out of the packet, freeze-dried type foods up on station. Pre-flight quarantine. So this lasts for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. NASA was doing it before COVID made it cool. And then there's CMO or crew medical officer training. So believe it or not, there is no physician necessarily on station at all times. There's a crew medical officer who may or may not have a medical background, who previously went through 40 to 60 hours of training, and now due to increasing training demands of astronaut candidacy, are probably down to 15 to 20 hours. And then at their disposal, they have access to the ISS medical kits, medications, procedure protocols, as well as 24/7 access to the flight surgeon team that is supplied by the 5 ISS partners. So CSA, ESA, NASA, JAXA, that Japanese Space Exploration Agency, and Roscosmos through Russia. Here is what crew health care looks like up on station. So it starts with what, like we talked about, prevention and monitoring. So that's the environmental health system, the closed loop life support system that scrubs the atmosphere of excess CO2 and pollutants. Then there's countermeasures. Famously, up on station, astronauts have to perform 2 hours of aerobic and resistive exercise a day, 6 days a week, to mitigate that risk of bone density and muscle mass loss. And my favorite bit of trivia around this is that when there was a second US module being added to the International Space Station, the late night show host Stephen Colbert is notoriously famous for being a space nerd, and NASA held an open vote to name that second module. So of course his fans overwhelmingly voted to name the second ISS module the Colbert, which for various reasons NASA decided probably wasn't the way to go. But the compromise that they reached was naming the second version of the treadmill that astronauts use up on station the Colbert, which is a backronym for the Combined Load Bearing Ergonomic Resistance Trainer. So if you ever want to impress someone or bore someone at a party, you can tell them that fact. Okay, and then we also have the health maintenance system, which consists of various very modularized healthcare, health tools, medications, equipment, etc. So there's the advanced life support pack, the basic life support pack, decompression sickness. So if you're a diver, you know that anytime you go from a high pressure gradient to a low pressure gradient, you risk getting the bends by virtue of nitrogen washing out of your system and lodging bubbles where they shouldn't. So on the spacewalk, that danger comes in because you are going from the 1 atmosphere pressure of the space station to a lower pressure environment in your spacesuit, so that you can actually move more easily. If you've ever tried to move around in a highly pressurized spacesuit, I have, and I'm here to tell you it is not easy by any means. So that's where the decompression sickness aspect comes into it. There's the ambulatory medical pack, crew contamination protection kits, their crew medical restraint system. So remember, you're floating in 0G, and if you have to treat a patient or if you have to perform CPR on them, Newton's third law states that if you're performing a single compression without bracing yourself, you're going to the opposite end of the space station. So that's why you need to restrain your patient in order to train them, to treat them. And of course, there's also packs for supporting airway, dental care, and linking with the flight support crew telemedically. It's a very interdisciplinary endeavor. So like I said, there's 24/7 international flight surgeon support, and it's very, the crews and the teams that support the astronauts include aerospace medical professionals, occupational health, human factors, psychologists, pharmacists. So it really does take all comers. And then we also use computer modeling tools to be able to support astronauts' health. So the first iteration of this is called the IMM, because we love acronyms in space exploration, in case you haven't caught on yet. So this is the integrated medical model. And basically, if you were trying to determine what you need to bring and how much of what medical supplies you needed to bring, you would input your mission duration, the number of crew you had, and then what level of risk you were willing to accept for risk of loss of mission, loss of crew, a risk of evacuation, as well as the level of health that you wanted to maintain. And then based on the current contents of the ISS medical kits, this would generate your outputs for your medical kit. So for example, if you wanted to extrapolate the medical kit contents for a 9-month mission, 3-person crew to an asteroid, you would put in those inputs. You're probably looking at this and saying, well, but what happens if you had pain multiple times? What happens if you had multiple infections, starting with a skin infection and then a urinary tract infection? Aren't you just depleting your supplies? So that's kind of one-dimensional, isn't it? So I'm glad you brought that up. So keep that thought in mind, because we're going to go through a solution. But I just also want to bring to your attention what we are planning to treat. So this is the top 100 list of integrated medical model conditions. So it includes everything from the common things like CO2-induced headaches to terrifying, catastrophic type things like cardiac arrest in space, to everyday but also terrifying diarrhea in 0G. And this is based on what has historically happened in spaceflight versus worst case scenarios that we absolutely want to be prepared for if it happens in space, including cardiac arrest and stroke or heart attack, which luckily have not happened to date. But if it happens, we do want to be prepared. So there is a defibrillator up on station, but we have not used it to date. So comparing that to what's historically happened, here's data from Space Shuttle over the course of 17 years. And if you're looking at this, you can see that luckily what tends to happen is the annoying but not the life-threatening. So space adaptation syndrome is the number one thing to contend with. Remember, that's where adapting to the zero-G environment and becoming intractably nauseated and vomiting in zero-G. Your other piece of trivia is that informally, this is called the Garn scale after astronaut Jake Garn, who famously or infamously became so sick he was just non-functional. So if you're high up on the Garn scale, that may not be the compliment you think it is. So the other things that happen in space, irritations to skin and subcutaneous tissue, whether that's abrasions, dermatitis, infection, injuries, trauma, digestive system complaints such as constipation. The scary stuff that we like, cardiac arrest, doesn't tend to show up here. There are instances of that recorded from Russian and Soviet space flights, but luckily any cardiac arrhythmias that we've seen tend to be self-limiting and asymptomatic. So again, not okay, so coming back to the challenge of a one-dimensional computer modeling tool, how do we overcome that? I am glad you asked. This is the Medical Extensible Dynamic Probability Risk Assessment Tool. Try saying that 3 times fast. It is cumbersome to say, which is why we call it the MedPrat. And so this is based on neural networking and Bayesian modeling, allowing us to be more dynamic and allowing us to correct for both adverse events as well as fixes at various mission time points to generate a series of different possible outcomes. So again, it's in the name, it's far more dynamic than the integrated medical model. And so NASA's exploration medical capability, their stuff is publicly available if you're interested. They continue to create new computer modeling tools. So the newest one is Impact Informing Mission Planning by Analysis of Complex Trade Spaces, looking at how to turn these risks into risks of loss of crew time, loss of crew life, loss of mission, and then using the knowledge that they have at their disposal to generate the tools as well as the procedures needed to act on this if it happens on mission. And informing this is yet another tool called Directed Acyclic Graphs, or DAGs, which is basically, to quote again Douglas Adams, looking at the fundamental interconnectedness of things. And so basically you take a known spaceflight risk. In this case, we can take, for example, a psychiatric disorder, and then saying, well, how might that be impacted? Is it due to the stress of a mission? Is it due to the interpersonal dynamics of the crew? Maybe crew astronaut A and B just really don't like each other. It might be due to mission stress. It could be further impacted by central nervous system changes. Remember, we talked about that CSF. Impaired drainage. And so it kind of looks at all of the inputs that we may want to consider, and then talk about how they might inform a spaceflight hazard and what it might be considered a contributing factor that's either internal or external. So it really is a way of parsing these extremely complex, nuanced medical issues. All right, so let's come back to our initial question. So we asked, what will we pack? Now the question is, how will we pack? So I hope you're getting the sense that there's not a lot of room up there. And so for those of you who are avid outdoors people, you may know of this as the backpacking principle. So we can only bring so much with us. If we're going on a hike or a camping trip, we're limited by what we can fit in our backpacks, that is the volume, and how much we can carry, that is the mass. So I like to call this the Aladdin principle of space, in that it's phenomenal cosmic power to get to space, itty bitty living space once we get there. So how does that translate into our challenges for packing for space? So that means that what we have to bring with us has to be low volume, low mass, low power. We're also limited by the power supply. It has to be low cost, ideally. It has to be easy to use. Astronaut time is at a premium. Astronauts are trained and directed down to the 5-minute mark. And it also has to have a long shelf life and be hardy, resistant to breakdown, resistant to the zero-G and radiation environment. So this question definitely tends to come up on midterms, hint, hint. So if you memorize one slide from this, make sure you flag this slide because it will help you answer your questions. As an aside, when I ask you midterm questions, I'm not sure if I will change up midterm questions, but look for what the question's asking, look for what is allotted points and how much points it's allotted to, and then just answer the answer to getting full marks on a question will be in the question. So that's just an aside. Okay, coming back to the fundamental interconnectedness of things. When we talk about successfully sending humans to space, the astronaut is just the tip of the spear. It comes down to engineering. It comes down to trusting the engineering of our closed loop life support systems. Comes down to trusting the personal protective equipment, both in the intravehicular activity and the extravehicular activity, IVA and EVA spacesuits, trusting, knowing the mission objectives, and then figuring out how human performance, the clinical aspects, the engineering, and the design all fit together. And then how prepared are we to deal with contingencies? So to translate how design translates into actuality, here's a snapshot of the medical kits up on station. So they're very, very compartmentalized, very modularized. So these are courtesy of NASA, but the medical kits, medications will be modularized. They'll be categorized by pain medications, by sleep aids, for example. You'll notice it's Ziploc bags all the way down. So if you didn't do that, if you go to get one Tylenol, suddenly it's Tylenol floating everywhere. The trauma kit, the wound kit will be modularized. The airway kit will be modularized. And then there's a snapshot of that defibrillator I was talking to you about earlier. Okay, so coming back to the idea of long duration missions, the RIDGE framework is really the overarching concept and framework in which we think about long duration space flight, but all of that leads to further considerations. So the NASA Human Research Roadmap is publicly available. It's interactive. I've included the link for you there. And basically, it's actually kind of fun to click on because you can look at the considerations we've talked about. We can talk about human factors, behavioral performance. You can look at radiation risks, and then you can click on those and you can see where NASA is in dealing with this. Is it something they've addressed and mitigated? Is it something that they don't have a good solution for and they've codified that in terms of yellow, green, red, and how that affects the mission? And so you can see that the risk of skills deterioration is somewhere on this list. So basically you can learn a skill on Earth before your Mars mission, but if you don't practice it, 9 months, for 9 months, you're going to de-skill and maybe cause increased risk to the mission. Okay, so summarizing the second part of the lecture, if you remember nothing else from this part of the lecture, it's simply that space is hard, space is expensive, and space is trying to kill us. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute or stick up your hand and interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll go coursing along. So how do we prepare for this high-risk environment?
There's a question here.
Yeah, go for it.
I have a question. I want to ask her, like in the space condition, what kind of infection we'll get?
Yeah, so infections, that's a great question. So this includes everything from bladder infections to skin infections to respiratory infections. One of the early Mercury or Gemini crews had all had colds. One of them had colds, and of course they shared them amongst each other, and that's when quarantine was implemented. Those of you who have watched Apollo 13, so kidney stones, we haven't talked about that, but based on various factors, including fluid shifts and increased calcium leaching from the bones, makes the formation of kidney stones more likely to happen. So that both the risk of getting a kidney stone, which is intractably painful if you know you've ever had one, but also getting an infected kidney stone is a real risk. And so there was in Apollo 13, Fred Hayes famously had urosepsis, and whether that was due to a kidney stone or that was impacted, or a bladder infection that was spread to sepsis. I have to go back and look into the details of, but basically if it can get infected, it's a very real risk. We also talked about germs being more virulent and T-cell production being impeded and the immune system being suppressed. So we've also seen reactivation of herpetic infections and shingles in spaceflight. So the list goes on and on and on. If you can think of an infection on Earth, it's very likely an infection risk in space. Does that answer the question?
I guess that fits. Okay, thank you.
Sorry?
She said yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
good, awesome. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so moving on. So how do we prepare for this environment that is trying to kill us? Well, what does let's ask another question. What does the International Space Station have in common with a remote rural village in India or Africa, or a polar, Arctic, or Antarctic medical deployment, or even an underwater research station? And the answer is they're all examples of remote, resource limited, isolated, and confined environments. And so these environments are somehow analogous to the spaceflight environment, and offers great test beds for preparing for space. So let's talk about them in turn now, and what we learn from these analogous or analog environments. Starting with micro and partial gravity. So parabolic flight, I think I alluded to this in the first few slides here. But parabolic flight, you may have heard of this as the vomit comet. And so this is when you're flying in an airplane up and down, up and down. And so you're accelerating upwards, and then you reach apogee, and then you're falling at the same rate as your airplane, which generates 18 to 20 seconds of free fall, or 0G, in which you can test key technologies, protocols, maneuvers, and science. And when you stack them together, going up and down, you get period after period of 0G with intermittent periods of 2Gs in between. So that allows us in this case, so I've, through our research institution, the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences, we've been testing these maneuvers. We've been performing parabolic flights since 2015. In this case, testing one of the world's first commercial spacesuits, and testing its range of motion for gross and fine motor movement, testing it with the visor down when pressurized. And again, when it's pressurized, it is hard to operate, but it is, these are all data points. So here's a quick minute-long snippet of what that looks like.
So that I can record it.
No rain in the background? No rain in the background. Umbrella?
So Adam, I will get the billboard back. I have to
So you can see there that we're working in very coordinated crews, that we'll have very dedicated roles. There'll be a test flight director, there'll be a suited test subject, there'll be someone monitoring, and we've rehearsed this in our ground crews and a grounded spacecraft and a dress rehearsal, and then finally we'll fly the flight. So that's an example of what parabolic flight looks like. But you might be saying, but Shawna, that is like 18 to 20 seconds of microgravity at a time. What happens if you want extended periods of microgravity? So I'm glad you asked. So gravity offset is another test bed in which we can replicate periods of microgravity for longer. So here's an example of some testing we did in a different kind of spacesuit, an EVA or extravehicular activity spacesuit, which we use for spacewalks. And we create periods of simulated partial or microgravity by inputting what percentage of our weight we want to offset. So 99% weight. If we think that if we want to emulate microgravity, or we can offset 83%, making ourselves 17% of our usual Earth-based weight if we want to emulate lunar gravity, and then we can offset 62% of our own weight, creating a 38% simulated gravity gradient if we want to emulate Martian gravity. But you might be saying, well, there's limits to that as well, because it's only what is in the harness that is offset. So you can see in this image, I'm simulating fixing a panel on the outside of the International Space Station. But if I drop my hoses, they're not floating around. They're going to just drop in the weight of 1G. And so again, every test bed has its challenges and limitations. So we talked about hypergravity. This doesn't get enough attention, but anytime we're talking about different phases of launch and landing, that implies increased gravity loads. So depending on the vehicle and the mission profile, usually it's about 2 to 3 to 4 G loads. And then in off nominal situations, or if you're going on a ballistic emergency trajectory, it can be higher than that. And so we simulate our physiological responses to that through centrifuge testing. So this was a study that we went through with the University of Texas Medical Branch, in which they wanted to see how different flight participants would experience different G loads. And so suffice to say that a 6GX front to back G load makes your chest wall 6 times heavier, and it actually becomes very, very hard to breathe. And there's physiological maneuvers that you can do to help breathe through that. We also learn a lot about water analogs. So again, this is through the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. And we in this scenario are simulating off-nominal landing scenarios in the Orion capsule. That is the capsule that will take astronauts to the moon on the Artemis missions. And so what happens if you you have to abort your ascent prior to reaching space? How does the suit interface with the water? And how can you get to your emergency craft? So lessons learned, it's super important not to get water in the IVA suit. That makes your test monumentally harder. We can also make use of the buoyancy of water to create another microgravity test bed. So this is our version of the neutral buoyancy lab. NASA has the world's largest NBL, 6.2 million gallons, which houses nearly the entirety of the space station underwater. So here at IIAS, we work out of Connecticut, and we simulate spacewalks to fix and swap out faulty modules outside the International Space Station. So here your period of microgravity is unlimited. You just kind of balance out your weights and your buoyancy in your dry suit to be neutrally buoyant. And then you work in teams with mission control, topside support, as well as managing your portable life support system and umbilicals and cables to be able to exit the airlock and then move down the strut to swap out a faulty module while maintaining communication, being safe, operating a drill underwater, which is a lot of fun, but also not dropping any of your components into the void, which makes your job monumentally harder. I think I mentioned earlier last class that some of my experience as an aquanaut. So again, exploration, no exceptions here. Neptune is again an acronym, stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. So here is a summary of the 2 aquanaut missions I took part in the Florida Keys in 2019 and again last year. And we were a team of 5, 2 Canadians, 3 Americans, performing key demonstrations in technology and studies in psychology and physiology. And so we were at 22 feet underwater in an underwater research habitat. That's us from the outside. We weren't wet the whole time. We were close to wet, but we had like an indoor habitat in which we would dive down into. We would stay there, and if we were going outside to do some excursions or exploration or drills, we would do so in our dive gear. And so some of the technology we tested, remember I was talking to you about virtual reality and immersive reality and its portability. And so this is disclosure. This is the company I worked for, Luxonic Technologies. And so I was the crew medical officer on both of those missions. And in the first mission, I liaised with the head of radiology in Saskatoon, over 4,200 kilometers away, to review the simulated trauma imaging of a patient in a digital twin of a radiology reading room to get remote inputs from an expert. And then on our second mission, we tested a new product, which was one of the world's first mixed reality point-of-care ultrasound devices to be able to perform a simulated trauma scan of a patient. And again, the advantage here is the real-time collaboration, as well as paying attention to those design constraints of austere environments, including mass, volume, and power constraints. And so NASA does the exact same thing with their astronauts, as does CSA and ESA. So this is the Aquarius Reef Base, 13 miles horizontally distant from the Jules Undersea Lodge where we were, a little bit deeper, 60 feet of depth versus 22. And so the difference is, again, if you're a diver, you know that beyond a certain depth, you have to decompress at a set rate. Otherwise, when you go from high pressure environment to a low pressure environment, bubbles will come out at a slower, at a rate at which they may lodge in places that will cause anything from joint pain to pulmonary embolisms to even and brain embolisms causing seizure, coma, or death. So that's bad. You don't want that. So to get out of deco, to desaturate, you have to come out of decompression at over a period of 16 hours and 47 minutes. So my favorite fact about the Aquarius Reef Base compared to the International Space Station is if you had to evacuate from the space station, you could evacuate in as little as 3 to 6 hours before getting back to Earth and getting into definitive medical care. So you can actually get to Earth quicker and to solid terra firma quicker from the ISS than you could from 60 feet underwater if you're in saturation. And then the other part of why we build Aquanaut Cruise as an analog for space is to work on those team dynamics in a resource-limited, isolated, confined environment, which we call ice environments. Speaking of ice environments, so there's also dedicated Mars and lunar analogs across the globe. So this looks like Tatooine, but this is a real place. This is the Mars Desert Research Station in the Utah desert. It is quite isolated. 2 to 3 hours, 3 hours outside of Salt Lake City, 2 hours out of Grand Junction. And basically you are living and working as if you are a crew on Mars. If you want to go outside, you have to suit up lest the Martian environment kill you. So I've been there twice, once as a crew commander and once as a crew medical officer. And you really do feel like you're on Mars. You're privy to these sprawling, amazing vistas that, you know, really lend themselves to believing you're on the red planet. So there's similarly lunar analogs across the planet. There's one in Poland. Here's us and our AAAS crew on a planetary geologic course outside Flagstaff, Arizona by Cinder Lake, which is where the Apollo astronauts actually performed their geologic training, except they had jetpacks, which seemed like a little bit more fun. But the idea is that a lot of the formations and the lava beds there lend themselves to similar geologic skills, which would be needed on lunar geologic surveys. And then back in the 60s, NASA actually detonated explosives to create a crater-like landscape to allow the astronauts to navigate a similar landscape. So in our case, we used those lessons learned from Apollo to design tools that were more ergonomic and more favorable to field use on a lunar EVA, and then tested them in that environment. Okay, so finally, rounding out the types of test beds we use on Earth to prepare for space, operational environments. So we don't necessarily need to be out in the middle of nowhere. So crew resource management and crew dynamics and learning to think quickly in highly fast-paced dynamic environments is critical. So here is an example of one of our high altitude noctilucent cloud campaigns. This was actually in high level Alberta because to see these specific kinds of clouds thought to be related to climate change, you need to be at a certain latitude. And so we chose high level Alberta, and we were using and testing a brand new tomography instrument, which you can see over my right shoulder there, that was paired with 2 similar instruments on the ground situated 200 kilometers apart. And the idea was by each of them triangulating and focusing on the same cloud, they would get be able to delineate the 3-dimensional structure of those clouds. So the point here is, sorry, not about the science. The point is about the crew management. So I was the payload specialist and working very closely with the mission specialist and the research pilot to make sure that everyone was taking care of everyone knew their objectives and that we could get the mission done. And finally, again, you don't have to go to the middle of nowhere. You can actually take away resources and simulate resource-limited environments. So here's a snapshot of my space medicine class, again, disclosure through IIAS, where we take non-medical experts and teach them principles of assessment, triage, and treatment, so as to be able to assess and manage injuries and pathologies in an environment where you don't have all of the usual medical equipment you need to. So you learn to think creatively, you learn to become a space medical MacGyver, and for example, use a tree branch to be a splint if you're focusing on the wilderness medicine aspect of it, or learn to communicate with a team that might be out in the field and do some teleoperations. So there are increasing standards around this in the analog world, and here's one of the papers that kind of delineates those standards. Okay, so we have about 12 minutes left, so let's come back to the bigger picture. What is the gold standard when we talk about providing healthcare on the moon, Mars, and beyond? And the idea is we want to provide at least the same standard of care on Mars as we do on Earth. And if we didn't worry about all of those constraints that I've been harping on, the answer would be, if physics wasn't a barrier, let's just bring another Earth with us. Let's just terraform Mars. Let's give ourselves an atmosphere. Let's give ourselves a magnetosphere. Let's give ourselves a better gravity gradient. Let's filter out those higher energy ionizing radiation. So why am I those constraints? Oh, someone wants to join this call. Let's bring them in. There we go. So the idea is, why do we want to, so why are we talking about taking away constraints? Because if we're flipping this question on its head, why don't we ask about why not just meet the standard of care as we have on Mars and on Earth, but why don't we aim to surpass it? So how do we do that? So this is where we talk about the technology and the future of medicine, but on Mars. And these answers and solutions may seem a little bit sci-fi, but the answer is a little bit closer than you think, or the future is a little bit closer than you think. So we talked about the challenges of a 6 to 9 month one-way trip to Mars and the decompensation that can occur. So some of you might be saying, well, why not just teleport there? Or, you know, what if we could create a partial gravity rotating space station, just like out of Space Odyssey 2001, or at least give astronauts exoskeletons who might be decompensated and have lost too much strength in their muscles over the course of that 9-month journey, just like in Star Wars. We talked earlier about skills decompensation and losing muscle memory on a mission to Mars. So what if we could upload those skills to our brains just like in the Matrix? Or what if we just said that's all too risky, and why don't we just send avatars of ourselves to the red planet? So again, the future is closer than you think. So we talked a little bit about immersive technologies, and in the context of spaceflight, mixed reality, augmented reality, and VR has been used on space station for just-in-time training for emergency scenarios. We've talked about digital twins to make technologies such as diagnostic imaging and radiology workflow more accessible. So we haven't brought that to space yet, but we have tested that in zero-G environments. There's videos here, so you can take a look through those, but I won't necessarily go through them now, just in the interest of time. But here's what you see when you slip into that red headset. So this is the exact same radiology workflow you would have on a typical high resolution monitor and typical PACS workflow and the same security and same markup tools. Oh, no, I said we're not going to go through those videos. And so speaking of skills deterioration, imagine you're the crew medical officer and you first learn to stick an IV in your patient on Earth, but then all of a sudden you don't need to call upon that skill until you're on Mars 9 months later. You've probably de-skilled and lost that muscle memory. And by the time you're done, your poor patient is going to look like a pincushion because you have lost that skill. And I've related that same anecdote to former crew medical officers, and they agreed that that exact scenario has happened. So coming back to that human research roadmap risk of deteriorating skills, what if we could retire that risk by practicing that skill set in VR? And so here's an example of a module that, again, through Luxonic commercial interest disclosure, we've created for the Canadian Space Agency for astronauts on long duration missions, so as to be able to avoid that risk of descaling, having unlimited redos, and being able to maintain that muscle memory. So here's a snapshot of us testing that in 0G. Here's one of my colleagues, Heidi.
Here is Heidi on video. Look at me and wave. Amazing.
And so let's get even a little bit more sci-fi than that. So this is an article from the MIT Technology Review circa 2017 called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And they make the argument saying in the era of CRISPR and gene synthesis, isn't it ethically wrong to send an astronaut with a frail human body into this known, dangerous, high radiation, high risk environment? And they make the argument that we should be splicing elephant genes into humans, not to create an elephant human hybrid, but because elephants rarely get cancer because they have so many copies of onco-editing genes, of genes that detect and fix DNA repair that makes us prone to cancer. And so the first step at that time was starting to look at splicing banana genes into different species, I think with the elephant genome. So this is where we are in 2020. So in 2020, the Rodent Research 19 experiment came back from the International Space Station, and they had genetically engineered mice. So that's that jacked up muscular adorable see on the left side of your screen compared to the wild type non-mutant mouse. And basically this genetically enhanced jacked up little mouse had a mutation called the ACVR2 neuromuscular blockade, which made it less prone to muscle mass loss and bone deterioration. And they had flown groups of both mutant and wild type and ground groups. And they could see that the flown genetically altered mutant mouse had less bone density loss and less muscle mass loss. So this could be potentially, first of all, this could help address neurodegenerative diseases such as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy back on Earth, and it can also help prepare astronauts for long duration spaceflight. So NASA is literally engineering Mighty Mouse. Okay, so that's an example of gene synthesis at work. So remember those principles we talked about, precision medicine technologies. So here's a summary slide looking at different applications for therapeutics, for gene-guided therapies, for diagnostics and biomarker discovery. And here is a summary paper as well as the link on how personalized medicine can apply to future spaceflight. So let's switch over to AI. So, you know, we've seen this in space, in science fiction, everything from the nefarious HAL 9000 to the sometimes helpful, sometimes annoying TARS in Interstellar. Here's where the state of artificial intelligence stands in space medicine today. So even in space exploration, AI has been used to parse data sets, to plan missions, to create early prediction and warning systems, and to streamline decision making as well. So there's potential for AI in space medicine, specifically for monitoring, early intervention, biomonitoring, diagnostic imaging, decision-making, and diagnosis. Remember, especially if you're the sole crew medical officer on a Martian crew, you want all the help you can get, and AI can be a tool towards that. This is an example of the AstroSkin. This is a Canadian innovation, a bio-monitoring technology that can be that has been flown to space. David Saint-Jacques worked to the International Space Station. We've tested it on parabolic flight and also in suborbital space flight. And AI partnered with or AI paired with Astroskin can be used for creating medical decision support systems, as well as early monitoring and detection systems based on the parameters of different biomonitoring parameters such as heart rate. 3D printing is also making progress in space. So the first ever 3D printer was sent to station with Made in Space in 2009. And that was the idea, was to be able to print different tools on demand. And now 3D printing has made its way into the realm of space medicine. And so as of last year, knee menisci have been successfully printed in space, and then Redwire Space has printed Redwire Space printed the human meniscus, and now 3D printed hearts on a chip. So cardiac myocytes are being sent to station to get a sense of how cardiac tissue reacts to increased radiation environments. Okay, getting even a little bit more sci-fi. So we talked about just bringing gravity with us, the idea of a rotating partial gravity, artificial gravity space station to prevent those fluid shifts, bone density, and muscle mass losses. So this is simple physics. We can generate gravity, an artificial gravity gradient, by virtue of the rate of rotation and the angular momentum squared times the radius of our space station. So the faster we spin and the longer our radius, the higher our gravity gradient. So this is actually happening today. So there's a very good review in Nature Microgravity on the international roadmap for artificial gravity. There are side effects and challenges. Like everything, it's not a perfect analog. So if you have a 1 meter high station and you yourself are higher than a meter, you're going to very much feel the gravity gradient between your head and your feet. If you move your head from side to side, you're going to feel those cross-coupling accelerations. And then there's also Coriolis effects. So there's a really good comprehensive paper on that available at Above Space. As a disclosure, I am a medical advisor to that company, but they are creating artificial gravity platforms. And before we end here, we're just going to go through a few more sci-fi concepts. So what about human hibernation? Surprise, again, it's being worked on here today. Both ESA and now NASA have funded studies in this realm. In 2019, ESA did some computer modeling around this and figured out that if you have a crew hibernate successfully for the better part of a 6 to 9 month one-way mission to Mars and wake them up 3 weeks before setting foot on the red planet, you can actually decrease the volume of the spacecraft as well as the resources by up to 33%. You might just be saying, well, Shawna, can't we just get a faster, can't you just get a faster spaceship? And that's also being worked on today. So this is a sci-fi-ish concept. It's still a few decades off for the Vasmer plasma engine and getting from Earth to Mars in as little as 39 days. So this simple answer is to be able to successfully not just survive, but thrive in long duration and exploration class missions. We are going to have to science the space out of this with a little bit of MacGyvering and craftiness as well. So to end, there is a lot on the horizon in space medicine. And I just want to end by talking about what is happening with respect to potential for benefits for Earth. So we're just going to skip to the very end, and I want to talk to you about a couple of case studies. So when we talk about these medical innovations, space forces us to think creatively and think resourcefully. And so iodine resin filtration, water filtration systems used on the International Space Station have successfully been spun off to act as water filtration devices for remote villages in Kenya. Handheld ultrasound has been used to provide maternal care to remote populations in the Canadian Arctic. Solar-powered refrigerators are used to create and store vaccines in areas with no electricity. The atmospheric scrubbers used to create and clean atmosphere are used in the produce transport and supply chain to increase the shelf life of produce. So there's a lot of applications for Earth benefit. And now we're looking at using zero gravity as the next platform for return to Earth. So here's a couple of case studies wherein we're manufacturing drugs in space because the protein crystals can grow larger and more symmetrically, in some cases making chemotherapy drugs such as Keytruda more shelf stable. And instead of sending a patient to a hospital for an infusion every month, they can administer the drug themselves at home. Lambda Vision is another case study of a company that's printing retinal layers, proteins layer by layer in the zero gravity environment, so as to be able to address Earth-based conditions such as macular degeneration and retinitis pigmentosa. A little bit closer to home, in an austere environment, I was on medical deployment in Ukraine in 2022, where basically our clinic consisted of a shipping container, and some of those same technologies that I demonstrated to you with portable point of care ultrasound and mixed reality made a perfect use case for being used in these resource limited environments. We've tested it underwater and in the Arctic Circle, as well as with some of the Canadian Space Agency astronauts. So in summary, there is a lot on the horizon when it comes to space medicine, and I hope we've hit most of these objectives when it comes to learning about the challenges of spaceflight, what's next on the horizon, tools are at our disposal, and how we can use the hardest of our challenges and the innovations that come from space medicine to address our greatest challenges on Earth. So thank you very much. Hopefully this is helpful to you. And if you have any questions for me here, well, somewhere is my email. Usually it's on the slide, but yeah, here's some additional resources in case you're interested in learning more. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I wanna ask her, are there any advantages for our health we can take to benefit our health in the space? Because we focus on the disadvantages, harmless for the human health from the space situation. So are there any advantages we can find
Are there any advantages of, sorry?
of the space to the human health?
So you're asking, if I understand the question, we've talked about the challenges to physiology. Are there any yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question. And one of them, that's one area that's come up in recent years, is when we talk about having disability on Earth, there's an argument being increasingly made that we're considered disabled by virtue of having an environment that doesn't meet our needs. So there's a couple slides on this that we didn't have time to go over, on this organization called Astro Access. And basically they take their ambassadors have everything from visual to hearing impairments to mobility impairments to being quadriplegic. And they've flown on parabolic flight in 0G with their own science. And folks who've been previously limited in mobility, whether through quadriplegia, being in a wheelchair, are suddenly able to mobilize in 3 dimensions. So that's how our abilities change in a different environment.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions at all?
I have a question. So
Yeah, go
so from what I understood from the last part is the water that they use is basically filtered and then reused over time.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
What about food? I'm assuming first of all, how many people are on the ISS regularly, and how much food do they have throughout the year? Do they spend?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very important question for Mars. So when we talk about water, the urine portable analyzer takes urine and used to have a 93% water return efficiency. So there was this joke that today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. And so with advances in technology, that's now 98% efficient. So you're still having losses and you still do need some water generation or resupply. For food, so with ISS, there are regular missions and regular crewed missions and also resupply missions to the International Space Station. These days, it's most usually through the Falcon, the SpaceX vehicle that can bring supplies to the mission. So food still is resupplied. It is not made on station. It needs to come regularly. And so there are experiments on station with for example, creating plants and hydroponics and edible like lettuce. And, you know, there's a lot of, there was a famous experiment over the pandemic where they baked cookies on station. But this is one of the big questions for Mars is how do we create a sustainable presence, especially if there's an issue with resupply? Because a one-way supply trip will be 6 to 9 months. So you have to both bring enough with you. You have to pre-supply in some cases and create your habitat and deploy it before the astronauts get there. And then also be able to create, if you're talking about long-term human settlements, create a way of creating an agricultural system on Mars. So there's entire startups around this. There's entire studies around this. It's a very good question.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Great.
Yeah. So, this has been outstanding. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for pivoting. I'm so sorry about the last minute change with the car situation, but at least we had technology to save us.
Yeah. Well, it just certainly shows we're quickly adaptable. You should have seen me running around. I realized in addition to everything else, I had to get here to the room because there were some students that we hadn't reached. So, yeah, but it all worked. So I think for all 7 of the students, they were happy. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
well,
great.
I will send out the recording once it's done processing.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.